Good evening and welcome to my channel. I am not going to tell you a story today. I am going to give you a bit of an insight into one aspect of story construction. I'm going to do a series of how-to videos, and the first thing I wanted to look at was how to build a character. So there are, as far as I am concerned, and everything I say is basically my opinion and what works for me, so take that with a large pinch of salt. Also, I'm making reference a few times to a story called Beeswax, which is the fifth story I wrote in this sequence. So if you want to look back, I'll put a link to video number 5 at the end of this, but you may want to revisit the fifth story I told called Beeswax in order to make sense of the rest of this. But it should still make sense anyway. So there are two ways to construct a character. If you come up with a plot, a situation, an idea for a story, then you may take the approach of then trying to find a character that would be the best person to go through that particular journey. Usually in terms of it being the most dramatic person. So you wouldn't want necessarily a highly competent SAS officer to deal with a hostage situation, because it's, you know, they'll be fairly competent at doing that perhaps, or you may not want a nursery school teacher to deal with a screaming child in a park, because again, too easy. Where's the conflict? It's usually best to throw someone into a situation that they're entirely incapable of dealing with. It just heightens the drama. I mean, you don't have to, obviously, but again, these are things that tend to work and that people have done from time immemorial. So it's worth learning from that. So which character suits the story you want to tell? That's one approach. The other approach is, I have a character that I want to explore. What situation would be the most interesting or life-altering to occur to that person? So I suppose we're talking, is the story you want to tell driven by a character, or is it an ideas piece into which you will insert a character that will exemplify your theme? Both are valid, and I guess different writers tend towards one or the other. I think I'm probably quite an ideas person, so I'll tend to start with the idea and then think, well, who do I want in this story? Who do I want to experience this adventure? There are similarly maybe two approaches to developing the character once you've decided roughly who will inhabit your story. So the first one would be a very methodical approach, knowing everything about the character, or knowing as much as the world that you're writing about requires. You might write a character biography. That's something that some writers do. Just a piece of prose, maybe one page, to describe who this person is and get to know them a bit better in advance. But I prefer the second approach, which is a little bit more oblique, which is I call discover as you go. So you do know something about the character. Like when I wrote Beeswax, I knew he was going to be a retired army captain and a beekeeper. And he was going to be fairly antisocial, but I didn't really know why, and I didn't really know what his family background was going to be, or entirely what his attitude to the rest of the villagers in the small Cotswold village where he lives would be. So those things kind of came out through the writing. Obviously, the more methodical approach probably will entail fewer rewrites, but not won't make a huge difference. I like the organic approach because I like to be surprised by my own writing. It keeps me keen if I'm discovering things as I'm actually, going through what the character's going through. And it sort of parallels the character's journey because they are discovering, probably in your story, they're discovering something about themselves. I'm trying to think of an example of a character who doesn't discover anything about themselves in a short story. If you can think of an example, just, send me a message, let me know. A character who starts off behaves. The story ends. They've learned nothing. They've changed in no way. I suppose I do like Bernard Malamud, and there are some very, very arrogant and sort of willfully unchanging characters in those stories, and that kind of makes a sort of tragic structure, because you can see how if the character were to change, their life would go better, but they don't. They cannot. That's their tragedy. They must pursue this self-destructive streak, and it will destroy them, and it does. Bit of a downer though, often, to take that approach. Okay, one thing is crucial with whatever character you create to be the protagonist of your tale. There must be conflict. This is something you've probably heard umpteen times in different forms about all sorts of writing. It's just a truism. There's going to be some conflict. The conflict is going to occur on largely two levels, internal conflict and external conflict. The internal conflict is usually between opposing things that the character either needs, desires, or wants. And I would distinguish those three. So a need is something that you absolutely on a survival level require. Food, drink, shelter, possibly friendship or some form of human contact. Desires are things that you through your baser instinct want. So money, sex, food, gluttony rather than just survival. And wants can be a slightly more elevated sort of thing. You may want to be remembered for something. You may want to help others. You may want to, be significant in some way. So there will be conflict, because there's usually a little voice that says, I don't deserve this, or I'm not good enough, or do I really want this, or am I following the correct path? So that's the internal conflict. In Beeswax, I have internal conflict in the character. Captain Fitch wants to be left alone, but by the end of the story, he realizes he has another want, which is to be useful. I can sort of think about whether those are needs or wants, don't know, or desires. I think mostly they're just fairly active wants. And he changes his behavior, or he lets us see another aspect of his behavior in the end when he gives the honey and therefore the clue and the answer to his neighbour who's a writer, who's got writer's block. Then, of course, there's external conflict, which is your character versus the world, whether the world is literally the world on some sort of sci-fi epic scale, or whether it's, anything that, the busybody neighbour next door. In the case of my story, in the mind of my character, the nosy villagers who want to pry and gossip and chat to our character, who's quite an introvert. So we've got those conflicts. Ideally, you should have both, really. Stories where there's only inner conflict can seem a little too esoteric, a little bit, solipsistic. And stories where there's only external conflict, it's pretty much Dan Brown, people running into rooms and shouting, punching each other, running away. That can be fun, but it doesn't keep you coming back again and again, I don't think. Well, maybe, who knows? There's usually mystery. There's something mysterious. There's something that either they do not want to tell you, the reader, or something that they do not want to admit to themselves. So we have a parallel process of discovery where the reader discovers more and more as the story goes on, and the character discovers something about themselves. Maybe they discover their limitations, or they discover they are capable of more than they thought. It depends whether you're writing essentially an optimistic story, a hopeful story, a pessimistic story, a tragic story. There has to be some sort of mystery. If everyone's an open book from the first sentence to the end, I'm not even sure that's a story or a narrative as such. It's more a description. It's more like an anatomical description of a character. Short stories are often about moments of discovery. So again, this does tie into mystery. So it could be discovery. I mean, it could actually be a mystery story, a detective story, where somebody finds something out that others do not know, or that others know but he or she does not know. Or it could be self-discovery, discovery about the world, discovery about secrets hidden within a family, something like that. Something will be unearthed and discovered, and the character will grow and develop. Generally, everything I say it has a caveat of generally, because there are writers, there are exceptions, there are always examples of people bucking the trend and doing something different, something experimental, and that's fine. I'm talking about what works and what is most common, and what your story will generally fall into if you don't try and do something clever and different. Clever because different. Okay, we have what I call an experiential fulcrum, which is a moment in someone's experience that changes things, that tilts the balance, hence the fulcrum metaphor. But what fulcrum needs is to move. You need leverage. You need something on the fulcrum to lift your character or to a new level, or lower them to a new level. So you need something. It's usually something from outside, something external. It's another person, it's a disaster, a phone call, a message, anything. It could be a sparrow landing on the tree outside the garden. It could be anything. It's tiny, huge. Something will come from outside their little contained world to shake things up. Otherwise, if the change comes only from within, if the change comes purely from within, with nothing from the outside world impacting, I would argue, is that real change? Because is that not just a sort of reshuffling of what's already there? It's not really a change as such. You could say certain parts of the mind might be locked off from others. So you could say that a memory that suddenly springs to mind sets off an inner chain reaction and causes somebody to see something differently. I suppose Virginia Woolf was very good at writing stories that were largely internal monologue, where a character sort of discovered and explained themselves to themselves. But you still have the external world, even in the case of somebody having a sense memory, and then going back into their past and having a nostalgic moment or something. It's going to be sparked by something in the real world. Probably they smelled something, it's most common, or heard something, or somebody came into the room and said something that gave them a sort of shock of deja vu. So that little fulcrum, be it large or small, will set them off on a different direction. You have to ask yourself the question, what is the primary driver of this character? What is it that what are their core beliefs? What keeps them getting up in the morning, really? That will give you a clue as to what you want to do to them. Because I think it was the excellent screenwriting podcast Script Notes by Craig Mazin and John August. They once discussed the fact that writing screenplays is a little bit like being a sort of sadistic torturer. You're trying to put your protagonist through as much as they can take before they break. I may sneeze. Maybe not. Here's suspense. It's coming, but we don't know when. Anyway, so what is that one thing that's going to keep them going? Will it change? It may change. I mean, that might be the thing that changes, but that would tend to be on a core belief level. That might be tough to do in a short story, maybe in a novella or a novel. So something will be shaken or modulated by the end of the story. The status quo will, in a sense, be reasserted, but it won't be exactly what it was before. As I said earlier, you can have you can have characters that don't change. If you do, they bloody well better be funny or entertaining in some way. I'm thinking of Confederacy of Dunces, and I don't think the central character in that changes very much. In fact, his unchangeability is kind of what makes him endearing. Otherwise, he'd just be an unlikable git, but he's very witty and intelligent, even though he's got a very restricted worldview. A fascinating character to spend some time with. You wouldn't want to actually know him, but you can write characters that don't change. But I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge to make the reader want to be with them. So looking at my story, Beeswax, I've got Captain Fitch. He's antisocial. He's introverted, and yet he does care for, nature. At least he cares for his garden. He looks after the bees. And there's I put in this little thing where he sort of teases this woman called Madeline, who wants him to call her Maddie, and he's known her for 25 years, and she always tells him the local gossip. And this is where you get a hint of what I'm going to talk about in another how-to video, which is the unreliable narrator. So I've tried to suggest in the story, maybe too subtly, that there's some attraction or interest there, but that he won't admit it to himself, so he sort of hides his feelings under this sort of guise of thinking of her as a gossip and someone he just wants to tease. But noticeably, he goes back to that shop again and again, and he obviously does listen to this gossip because he's able to refer to it, and So there's a small note in the story, but it's there. The internal and external conflict's definitely there. Sometimes you can have one disguised as another. So we have in my story, you've got the neighbour across the fence who wants to talk, who wants to introduce himself, is quite loquacious and quite extroverted. And that is a sort of external antagonist to our hero, who is by nature very antisocial, very indrawn. He has his rituals of things he wants to do in his day, and he doesn't really want to be disturbed by this person. He doesn't want to go through the whole, oh yes, I'm a beekeeper and I'm a retired army captain. He's towards the end of his life, and he's very much stuck in his ways. But the internal conflict is that he does find this person quite interesting, and against his will, he sort of finds himself thinking about the story that the neighbour is writing. And he, in the middle of the night, he just comes up with a brainwave of how to solve the writer's dilemma. And he realizes he does have a desire to help. And in fact, it would do him more harm than good to keep it to himself and not to do that. So he does help. He also has a slight, an unusual weakness which doesn't fit with, how he characterizes himself, which is that he's quite nostalgic and misses his wife, whom he shared most of his life with and who passed away some time in the past. You get a feeling that she would probably have discouraged his more isolationist tendencies. So hopefully that's there in the story as well. So I think if we talk about learning, which is one of the most boring ways of putting it, but on a small level, he learns that contact can be good. Like, you can make new friends at any age, and it can be a good thing. In the story, I think surprise is quite important. I think surprise is quite important in any story where you've got a fairly fixed structure, you definitely want this to happen, then this to happen, then this to happen, and by this point the audience is thinking that, and then something happens and changes their mind, and then at the end, the more structure you put in, the more you want to put in little quirks and moments of surprise. Otherwise, it's going to seem too programmatic. There are all sorts of questions you can ask yourself. So I mentioned a hobby that he plays the clarinet, just to have this thing where the audience goes, oh, okay, I didn't let me fit that in with the picture I have of my character. It stops him becoming a cliche. deepens the character without having to. I'm not going to write 3 paragraphs about what kind of music he plays on his clarinet. I'll allow the audience the reader, the listener, to fill that in. So there's 4 useful sort of aspects of a character's world that are worth knowing in advance, or are worth thinking of at some point in your story creation process. They're in no particular order. So we've got jobs and work, the world of work. Is the work that the character does vital to their core, being? Are they defined by their work? Is it a vocation, in other words? You might say a doctor or a brain surgeon or a lawyer or maybe not lawyer, I don't know, an astronaut or a sports person or a writer has a vocation. They have something they feel driven, they must do. A scientist. Of course, there can be people even in those professions who see it more as a job. I don't necessarily think Barbara Cartland thought of herself as a sort of driven, world-changing creative artist. I think she probably thought, I write books, they're very popular, I need to get one out a year. Who knows? I may be doing her an injustice. So there's that. There's also networks, obviously, networks of people. In a short story, certainly the 1,000-word stories that I'm writing, I can only really fit 1 or 2 subsidiary characters in that, unless they're absolutely key to the story. So in Beeswax, obviously, I've got the neighbour, the writer next door. I've also got people mentioned in passing, but they don't really pop into the story in real time. They're described by the main character as someone that they have encountered or regularly encounter. But they're useful, they're essential, really. And you can write a story about a person on their own in a wilderness. There's some really good films that way, because you're looking at them from outside and observing their behaviour. But you can write another Into the Wild or 137 days or whatever it's called, 127 days. There's 127 hours. He spends a long time in the desert before he chews his own arm off. Doesn't, he cuts it with a penknife. Anyway, spoiler. So we've also got beliefs. Now, and I don't mean just religious beliefs. What does the character hold as an absolute essential truth? And that can be very useful in terms of theme. It's like the character stating the theme of their life to themselves. So I suppose my character would be, the essential truth of this character is, I've worked hard all my life, I've had the greatest love I can imagine, and she's gone, I just want to be left alone. That's probably it, And the question is, do you then disrupt that? Do you let them have that as their core belief throughout the book, throughout the story, or do you shatter it in some way? I'd be tempted to say get the hammer out for that one. And then, of course, we have loves and enthusiasms, cultural pursuits, hobbies, pastimes, fixations, things that they enjoy doing, things that you can take them into another world or another subset of their world and show them interacting, show them not just thinking about their emotions all the time, which can be tedious, frankly. Those are useful words. So we've got work, networks and friendships, belief systems, and love. I call it loves, but I suppose you'd say enthusiasms or hobbies, or it sounds a bit pitiful to say hobbies. We spend so much time doing these things, it must be important to us. And really the last thought I want to leave you with is, if you can just ask yourself, would my reader or my listener want to spend any more time with this person? Would they want to know anything more about them at the end of the story? Because I think generally the answer should be yes. You want to leave them wanting more. You want to leave them thinking that this person has a life that's much bigger than the small slice that you have shown. And if you can do that, then you will have readers who want to read more of your stuff. And it's obviously a great skill to learn if you plan to write a series of books with the same characters. You don't absolutely unearth every single shred and detail of that person's character in book one, because you've got to leave something for the rest of the series. But we're talking short stories, and really, I suppose the thought I would leave you with is just, make sure when you've come up with a character whose story you want to tell, that you enjoy spending time with them, and that the audience will want to spend that time with them, and possibly more. And so those are my thoughts on character. I might go deeper into some aspects of it in another how-to video. There's a link here to the story that I've referred to several times, Beeswax, so you may want to listen to that and subscribe, and I will be back with more thoughts on aspects of short story writing very soon. So thanks for listening.